1940. Before restaurants, Schoenbaum tried selling cars. He tried hair tonic. He tried insurance. None of it stuck. Years later, he described himself as, quote, an inferiority-complexed guy who has to break his back in order to make it work. The Parkette wasn't much. A small building on the west side of town. A hamburger cost a quarter. His wife Betty liked to say you could get a burger, fries, and a slice of strawberry pie for 50 cents. But the doors stayed open, and people came. A few years in, Schoenbaum met Bob Wyan out in California, the guy who invented the Big Boy double-decker hamburger. On February 7, 1952, Schoenbaum became a Big Boy franchisee and renamed his spots Parkette Big Boy Shops. He had the franchise rights for 11 southeastern states, but the name bugged him. In May of 1954, he ran a public contest to rename the restaurants. The winning entry was his own nickname, Shoney's, short for Schoenbaum. By June, 5 little drive-ins in West Virginia had a name that would end up on buildings in 36 states. Now here's where the story really starts. A guy named Ray Dan Nur down in Nashville bought a Shoney's franchise in 1959, paid $1,000 for it. One restaurant in Madison, Tennessee, and Dan Nur turned out to be one of the most obsessively hands-on operators the restaurant industry had ever seen. He had this thing people called Dan Nur's Way. He'd show up at a Shoney's unannounced, walk straight past the manager, and go check the restrooms himself. If they weren't clean enough, you heard about it. He had mystery shoppers. He had standards for the speed of the food, the temperature of the coffee, the way the hostess greeted you at the door. The man ran a restaurant chain the way a surgeon runs an operating room. In 1971, Dan Nur bought the Shoney's trademark and assets from Schoenbaum. They merged. Dan Nur became CEO. Schoenbaum became chairman. Headquarters moved to Nashville. And under Dan Nur, Shoney's doubled in size every 4 years. The man was a machine. Hold that detail about Dan Nur running everything personally. Every restroom, every hostess, every plate of food. It matters more than anything else in this story, and we're coming back to it. But there was a problem baked in from the beginning. The Big Boy franchise agreement said Shoney's could only operate in those 11 southeastern states. Dan Nur wanted the whole country. So in April of 1984, Shoney's paid Marriott, who owned Big Boy at the time, $13 million to end the franchise agreement. At that point, Shoney's was the largest Big Boy franchisee in the country, with 392 locations. They dropped the Big Boy name, dropped the Big Boy burger, and stood on their own. They'd already started building their own identity back in 1977 with a new mascot. A friendly brown bear in a red Shoney's t-shirt. The Shoney Bear. Kids loved that thing. There were plush toys and overalls, coin banks where the bear was giving a thumbs up, little cups with his face on them. For a whole generation of families in the South, that bear on the sign out front meant one thing: Sunday. And if your family ever drove the interstates through the Southeast, you know what I'm talking about. Shoney sat right off the highway, and on a family road trip, that sign meant you were stopping. It meant food. It meant a restroom that was actually clean, and it meant your dad was in a good mood for the next 100 miles because he just ate his weight in bacon. Church crowds, road trip families, local regulars who came every single week, Shoney's pulled all of them. That building was never empty on a weekend morning. And if you're over 50, I don't have to describe any of this to you, because you've been there. You know that booth. You know the feel of it on a Sunday morning. Your whole family packed in. Your dad already on his second plate. Your mom telling him to slow down. You know the line at that breakfast bar and the way it snaked past those silver chafing dishes, scrambled eggs, bacon sausage links, pancakes, biscuits and gravy, grits, waffles, cinnamon rolls, muffins, fresh fruit, and about a dozen other things you were going to try even though you were already full 3 plates ago. Your grandmother put a biscuit in her purse. Don't pretend she didn't. I remember standing by the register staring at that Shoney bear like it was a real animal behind glass. I was maybe 5 or 6, didn't care about the food yet. Just the bear. That's a strange thing to remember this many years later, but that's how Shoney's worked. It didn't try to be the thing you'd never forget. It just was. That breakfast bar launched in 1981, right on the heels of the salad bars that had swept the restaurant industry in the 70s. And it changed everything. Morning sales at Shoney's had been falling for years, and this reversed it almost overnight. They expanded the bar to over 40 items. All you can eat. One price. By the end of the 80s, breakfast drove about 25% of total sales at company-owned restaurants. People weren't coming to Shoney's for a menu item anymore. They were coming for the bar. Hold that too, by the end of this story, that breakfast bar is doing 60% of Shoney's total sales. 60%. One offering. That number is going to matter. And then there was the hot fudge cake. 2 layers of chocolate cake with vanilla ice cream in the middle, hot fudge poured over the top, whipped cream, and a cherry. Shoney's says they still serve over 2 million of those a year. That dessert alone was a reason to go. Here's the thing to hold on to, because it explains everything that comes after. Dan Nur was the product, not the breakfast bar, not the hot fudge cake. The man and his obsession with control were the reason every restaurant in the chain ran the way it did. The food mattered. But the system that delivered the food, that was Ray Dan Nur. Remember that. So how big did it get? Bigger than most people realize. While Shoney's was growing, Dan Nur was building a whole empire around it. He'd started a seafood concept back in 1969, originally called Mr. D's Seafood and Hamburgers. Part of the reason he created it was because the Big Boy Agreement wouldn't let him take Shoney's outside those 11 states. So he built something else that could go anywhere. He renamed it Captain D's in 1975 and focused it on seafood, kind of like a Long John Silver's. And it took off. By 1980, there were more Captain D's locations than Shoney's restaurants. By 1985, the seafood chain was bringing in about 30% of the company's total sales. They also picked up a struggling chicken chain called Famous Recipe, renamed it Lee's Famous Recipe, and more than doubled its sales in a few years. Through the 80s, the whole machine ran smooth. Shoney's kept expanding, Captain D's kept expanding, the stock climbed. Everything Ray Dan Nur touched seemed to work. By the mid-90s, the Shoney's family of restaurants had pushed into 34 states. They signed Andy Griffith as a national spokesman in 1996. And for the people who grew up watching the Andy Griffith Show, seeing that man on a Shoney's commercial was about as warm and trustworthy as advertising gets. The system peaked at over 1,800 restaurants total. $2 billion a year in sales. 34,000 employees. One of the largest restaurant companies in the entire country. That was the top of the mountain. And if you walked into a Shoney's on a Saturday night in 1992 or 1983, you felt it. The parking lot was full. There was a wait for a booth. The breakfast bar was stacked, the dining room was loud, and that Shoney bear was smiling at you from behind the register like everything was going to be fine forever. For a brief window there, Shoney's felt permanent, like it had always been there and always would be. It wouldn't. Quick thing before we keep going. If this is bringing back Sunday mornings at Shoney's for you, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next brand we dig into. Because what I'm about to show you was already set in motion while the company was sitting up there on that peak. And both of these things trace straight back to Ray Dan Nur. In 1988, Dan Nur engineered a massive recapitalization deal worth $728 million. Now, if you're not a finance person, what that meant in plain terms is the company took on an enormous amount of debt and used some of that money to pay shareholders a special cash dividend of $16 per share. Dan Nur owned about 19% of the stock at the time. His personal cut of that dividend came out to roughly $111 million. Cash in his pocket. I mean, think about that for a second. $111 million pulled out of the company in a single transaction while the company took on the debt to pay for it. That money didn't appear from nowhere. It came from Shoney's future. Every dollar of that debt would need to be paid back, with interest, out of revenue that hadn't been earned yet. Remember that number. When you hear later that they couldn't afford to remodel their restaurants, couldn't afford to compete with newer chains, couldn't afford to fix basically anything, this is where the money went. And then came the lawsuit. It started with two people. In April of 1988, a married couple named Billy and Henry Elliott, both Shoney's managers, were fired. Their offense, according to the lawsuit that followed, was refusing to go along with the company's discriminatory hiring practices. They lost their jobs for refusing to discriminate. And they went to a lawyer named Tommy Warren, a former college football star turned civil rights attorney in Tallahassee. On April 4th, 1989, Warren filed a class action in federal court in Pensacola, Florida, Haynes versus Shoney's. 9 named plaintiffs, 5 black employees, and 4 white managers. The NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund joined the case alongside civil rights attorney Barry Goldstein. The plaintiffs initially sought more than $500 million. What they alleged was systematic racial discrimination across the entire company, not isolated incidents, a system. The claim was that Shoney's refused to hire black applicants or deliberately confined them to jobs in the back of the restaurant, dishwashing and kitchen work, out of the customer's view. Managers who spoke up or resisted were allegedly punished or pushed out. White managers were part of the plaintiff class specifically because they said they'd been retaliated against for objecting. And here's the detail that still stops people. Testimony alleged that Dan Nur told managers to, quote, lighten the place up in restaurants where he felt too many black employees were working. Other managers said the code word was that it was too cloudy and to lighten it up some, and managers were allegedly instructed to mark black applicants' job applications by darkening the letter O in the Shoney's logo on the form, or the letter A on the word application. That was supposedly how they flagged which applications to set aside. The case later inspired a book called The Black O by Steve Watkins, published in 1997. Here's the part that no other video about Shoney's tells you. By the early 90s, a man named Leonard Roberts was CEO. He'd already turned around Arby's and had a reputation for fixing broken companies. And Roberts became convinced that Shoney's was going to lose this lawsuit badly. The board didn't believe the allegations. Roberts did. So he went to Dan Nur's house. According to Roberts, he sat across from Dan Nur and told him he had 24 hours to agree to settle the case for $130 million. If he didn't, Roberts said, Shoney's would join the lawsuit on the side of the plaintiffs. Against its own founder. Dan Nur threw him out of his house. The next morning, Dan Nur agreed, but on one condition. Roberts had to resign. Roberts later said he walked into the board meeting expecting a standing ovation. Instead, he lost his job for doing the right thing. That detail right there tells you everything about what kind of company this had become behind the warm memories and the breakfast bar. Dan Nur denied the allegations throughout. But the case went on, and in January of 1993, the court approved a consent decree. $132.5 million. $105 million went to the class. Somewhere between 10,000 and 40,000 black applicants and employees were covered, depending on which estimate you use. 11 people received the maximum payout of $100,000 each. The class period ran from February of 1985 through November of 1992. At the time, it was the largest racial discrimination settlement in American history. Dan Nur personally surrendered stock worth about $65 million as part of the settlement. That was roughly 83% of the company's total settlement burden coming out of one man's holdings. He became a life member of the NAACP. He didn't stand for re-election to the board. By March of 1993, Shoney's bought out the remainder of his stock and he was gone. Completely. The man who had run everything. Who had been the reason every restroom was clean, and every hostess smiled and every breakfast bar was stocked by 6 in the morning, was out. Remember what I said. Dan Near was the product. And the product just walked out the door. What he left behind was a company carrying a mountain of debt from the recapitalization and the reputational damage of the largest discrimination case the industry had ever seen. And no, they weren't ready for what came next. Here's what a company looks like when the only person who knew how to run it is gone. Between 1986 and 1997, Shoney's went through 6 different CEOs. 6 in about a decade. Every one of them walked into a company loaded with debt from the recapitalization, still dealing with the fallout of the discrimination case, and trying to figure out how to run a chain that had been run by one man's sheer force of personality for 30 years. And no, I'm not making that up. 6 CEOs. In 1997, the founder's son, Ray Schoenbaum, who was a minority shareholder at this point, launched a proxy fight to remove the current management and board. He publicly called the food at Shoney's terrible, his own family's restaurant chain, and he went on record saying the food was bad. The stock had dropped about 70% over the prior 3 years. The proxy fight cost the company somewhere between $5 and $6 million just to fight off, and in the end, the younger Schoenbaum and a few allies got seats on the board, but the damage was done. That's money and energy spent fighting each other instead of fixing the restaurants. And if you walked into a Shoney's in 1987 or 98, you could feel the difference from a decade earlier. The carpet was the same carpet. The booths were the same booths. The wallpaper hadn't moved. Places that used to have a line on Sunday morning now had open tables. The building felt like it was still living in 1986 while the rest of the world had moved on. And while management was turning over and the boardroom was on fire, all 3 of those details I asked you to hold came due at the same time. The debt from the 1988 recapitalization meant there was no money for remodels, no money for marketing. No money for any of the things you need to do when your restaurants are starting to look tired and your competitors are opening shiny new buildings down the street. And the breakfast bar, the thing that saved them in the 80s, had turned into something they couldn't get away from. By the late 90s, roughly 60% of every dollar spent at Shoney's came off that bar. Their own CEO called it an addiction. The problem was, buffet restaurants had exploded all over the country. Golden Corral, Old Country Buffet, Ryan's, dozens of regional players, and those places were bigger, newer, with more items and more space. Shoney's couldn't match them. The buildings were too small, and the money to expand them wasn't there, because of that debt. So they were stuck. The bar was their identity, but they couldn't compete on the bar anymore. And walking away from the bar meant walking away from 60% of their sales. And then there was the expansion. Remember, Shoney's had spent decades confined to 11 southeastern states. Once they paid that $13 million to break free from Big Boy in '84, they pushed hard. Too hard. By the mid-90s, they were in 34 states. But Shoney's had a deeply southern identity. Andy Griffith, Jeff Foxworthy, who did their commercials in 2002 and 2003. Biscuits and gravy. Grits. Sweet tea. This was a concept that was built for the Southeast, and they rushed it into markets where nobody had heard of them and nobody was asking for them. When they started closing underperforming locations, a lot of them were in those new states. You'd see a Shoney's in Ohio or Pennsylvania sitting half empty on a Friday night, while the Applebee's across the street had a 45-minute wait. Nobody up there had the memories. Nobody up there grew up on the breakfast bar. It was just another restaurant with a bear on the sign. Today, Shoney's has retreated almost entirely back to the Southeast. Most of the roughly 55 that are left sit in Tennessee, Georgia, Virginia, and the Carolinas. The expansion was a bet, and the bet didn't pay. In 1996, already buried in debt, the company borrowed another $100 million to buy its largest franchisee, TPI Enterprises, for $164 million. TPI brought in 176 Shoney's restaurants and 67 Captain D's. Sounds like a good deal until you find out those restaurants were performing about 20% worse than the ones the company already owned. Analysts called it a major interference that derailed the turnaround plan. So they spent $164 million to buy somebody else's problems. That year, revenue hit $1.2 billion, but the company posted a net loss of $35 million and closed 75 locations. By 2000, the company was delisted from the New York Stock Exchange. They restructured their debt, cutting about $149 million off the books. 2 years later, Lone Star Funds bought the whole company for about $240 million and took it private. They sold off Captain D's in 2005. And across the South, people started noticing the Shoney's down the road was closed. The sign was dark. The parking lot was empty. The bear wasn't smiling at anybody anymore. One by one, they just went quiet. In 2007, a man named David Dawoodpour bought the Shoney's brand through his company, Royal Hospitality. At that point, there were about 282 locations left. He started remodeling, pushing franchising, trying to breathe life back into it. And the count just kept falling. 282 became 165, then 150, then 55. Along the way, they tried everything. They changed the tagline from classic American food to come back to what's good, which, if you think about it, is kind of an admission that you left. They signed Jeff Foxworthy in 2002 to do TV commercials. He did these breakfast buffet spots where his fictional uncle Delbert ate too much at the bar. Funny commercials. Didn't save them. Dawoodpour has been talking about a return to the glory days for years. Their website still says they're growing fast and expanding. 55 restaurants. In a country where they once had over 1,800. That website is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Nobody killed Shoney's. Not really. It was a bunch of things that all landed at the same time, and most of them trace back to the same man. Dan Nur built it with his own hands. He set every standard. He checked every restroom. He made sure that breakfast bar was full, and the hostess was smiling, and the coffee was hot. And then he pulled $111 million out of the company, left behind a scandal that cost another $132 million, and walked away. And the 6 people who tried to replace him found out that you can't replace what was never a system. It was just a man. Dan Nur was the product, not the breakfast bar. And when the product left, there was nothing underneath holding the rest of it up. And here's the detail I want to leave you with. Alex Schoenbaum, the guy who scraped together $2,500 for a drive-in in West Virginia, the inferiority complexed guy who broke his nose 4 times and sold hair tonic and built a name from his own nickname, he died on December 6, 1996. 81 years old. 2 weeks earlier, he'd received the Bunai Brith Great American Tradition Award in Sarasota. He had a heart attack the very same week. He never saw the proxy fight. He never saw the TPY acquisition. He never saw the